Good afternoon and welcome to the National Association of Black Counselors monthly discussion. This month we are talking about the Black church, faith, spirituality, and mental health. We have a phenomenal panel and our moderator for today is Dr. Latonia Laffitte. She is a partner in the Bridges Wellness Group. She has a doctoral degree in counselor education and supervision from Argosy University. And her focus is on, she deals with veterans, LGBT community, and she's just a phenomenal person. So I'm going to turn it over to her. Dr. Laffitte.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nick, and thank you for that awesome introduction. I greatly appreciate it. As Dr. Nick said, we have an awesome panel here with us today, and I'm going to allow them to go ahead and introduce themselves. We will start with Dr. Edwards.
I'm Doris Edwards. I reside in D-Man at Virginia Union. My topic research was a recovery method for African-American pastors suffering and impacted by clergy burnout, which led me to delve into mental health in a serious way. I've adjuncted a couple of seminaries, mentored doctoral students, just a little bit. Thank you.
Dr. Chase.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bridget Chase, and I'm in private practice here in Washington, D.C., been a clinician for well over 27 years. I believe in a strong integrative approach, meaning that I pull from whatever resources. Most of my clients prefer Christian and secular counseling, so I pull from any resources I can to assist with empowering and evoking change for that client. My topic of study when I did my dissertation was on spiritual and clinical tools to assist licensed professional counselors with working with Christians and those of Christian or faith-based communities.
And Ms. Thomas, forgive me if I forgot your title.
Girl, I don't have a title.
You are missing.
They don't do titles for me. So hi, my name is Danyelle Thomas. I am the founder and digital pastor of Unfit Christian and its associated faith community, the Unfit Christian Congregation. I do work that helps Black folks navigate the intersections of faith, race, gender, sexuality, and other points of marginalization as they are navigating their faith spaces. So I tend to deal with a lot of folks who are moving through the grief and unpacking of their religious trauma. Happy to do this work and happy to join this panel.
Awesome. Dr. Span?
So good evening, good afternoon to everybody. I would like to say that I am happy to really be here to be a part of this moment to talk about spirituality and just thinking about the Black church in general. My background is that I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. I've done tons of work working with the African-American community. I just finished up as chief clinical officer in founding a digital community called Hurdle, which looks at changing culture shifting for people of color. And also my dissertation was also looking at spirituality and how it can impact and change risky sexual behavior in queer men, Black men. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So as you all see, we definitely have an esteemed panel here with us today, and I'm definitely excited to hear everybody's feedback. So we're just going to jump right in here. So historically, Black churches have had to fill many dimensions within the Black community. What are your thoughts on the role of the Black churches within the Black community as it relates to mental health?
Well, for me, I believe that the Black church is the stakeholder. It's the stakeholder, it's the change agent. It is the beginning of a new day when it comes to openly embracing the idea of mental health therapy, clinical therapy, Christian therapy for anyone that may be seeking out assistance, not only from the church, but also from a trained, licensed professional that can assist with those areas that you're in balance with, your equilibrium may be off. And sometimes you need assistance from the church, but the church should also support you getting assistance from a licensed clinician. Mm-hmm. I still believe that they are the major stakeholder when it comes to breaking the stigmas, when it comes to mental health and mental health providers and mental health profession.
I concur with Dr. Chase. I strongly believe that, the spirituality church, the Black church is a protective factor for the community, and it's always been an anchor. And then you have Black spirituality that goes beyond what was the Christian Black church, which we know of. But at the same time, when we think about as African Americans it being a staple for being the go-to for the Black community, as well as it being a staple for understanding Black spirituality and Christianity within our community. And still being that as we change and look at mental health being a cooperative part and how we collaborate now with spirituality, church, as well as mental health services.
I concur with two colleagues that the Black church is the center. For me, my approach to Black church from its origin, it was for fellowship, worship, and community. And it's under that formation that many of us arrive at the even middle point where we're at now. I believe I want to start out by trying to deconstruct from the Black perspective the stigma. There's a book entitled "Why Do Christians Shoot Their Wounded?" And it's all undergirded. Every component, every aspect, every avenue of the African American life is undergirded by our spirituality. And many of you already know our formation as African American and our identity is closely connected to our spiritual formation. And for me, as a researcher, until we're able to deconstruct some of the European lens by which we see faith, religion, and spirituality, and open the door for mental health, because even from a Christian perspective, if we watch the pilgrim and journey of Jesus, at every aspect of healing and restoration, Jesus takes a psychological approach. And could it be, as we're talking right now, I've shared this with a couple of colleagues and deans, could it be that the Black church, when it comes to mental health, is in a schizophrenic state? If you know Bible, if you look at the man dwelling among the tombs, he's cutting himself. If you compare that passage with a person who is schizophrenic, it's the antidote. And so we look as African Americans in this country, our spiritual formation to some degree have fractured and cut us to the point that we are hurting and killing ourselves. And so that means that we have to go back to dig up and reconstruct what has been placed, even from a spiritual perspective, through our theology. It gave us hope without expecting transformation.
Dr. Edwards, preach.
So how can we now, as researchers, clinicians, go back to deconstruct the stigma, first of all, before we move forward, by educating not only pastors, but the congregants and the community in such a way that they don't see mental health as something as sinful or bad decision, rather to see mental health just like any other ailment. And I think it boils down to the church, because as the church in beginning, worship, fellowship, and community, it was the community part that connected others in all of our brokenness, whether it's mental health, whether it's physical. And so this conversation for me is interesting because we have to do some deconstructing in order to move forward. Thank you.
Dr. Edwards, that was interesting what you just said. So historically, the church has been the safe space. After slavery, they were allowed to worship in peace, have a day off, a day of rest. That was their safe space. And when it comes to talking about your mental health, you have to feel safe. However, and I hear you say you have to go back and deconstruct, but in some churches, mental health or schizophrenia is demonized when someone says, I hear voices. What are your thoughts on that?
It's one's interpretation. Most of us being raised in the Christian church have been culturalized to a religion that we only hope but never expect transition. And so when we, at the end of the day, if you are a Christian, the perfect example is Christ. If you watch Christ and his movement, we see what we need to do. And so even before slavery, we brought practices to this country that we still participate with in rituals. But being stripped, this is a word you hear me use, when we were stripped of our identity. Our identity was more than our culture. We're stripped, I call it rape. We were raped of our culture, our identity. Now I'll give you a faith to believe in something that is so abstract that it don't become real. It's just you keep hoping, but never look to receive it here. It's always when I die, I get it. And so out of that is birth. The best way to control a people is to break them not only spiritually, but to break them mentally. When you follow scripture, I get to this. We have been conditioned to be driven by emotions. And I've learned this in my second phase, trying to get to a ELR as clinical, that emotions is really an illusion. Right? And so how do I move from an illusion to the immediate reality of who I am? And so understanding the whole concept of Christianity, the religious concept, for me, it's the beginning point of deconstructing a theology that was designed to give me hope, but yet oppress me. So how do I move beyond oppression? We're in this conversation, in my opinion, is because we have been oppressed mentally so long that what we think is healed is really not healed. And so for me, being in conversations and lectures like this, it's moving from just being healed to being transformed. Because I'm healed, I will always have another reoccurrence. If I'm transformed, I have tools to put in place that I can prevent that reoccurrence. And so the Black church, I think, it is the avenue to start, particularly for African Americans.
But okay, so
that's something. I wanted to say something in regards to Dr. Edwards. You know, it's what you're saying reminds me of the stories of Willie Lynch when it came to slavery. It's not just about him being the greatest marketer and teaching plantation owners how to keep us separate. Religion was also a big part of that. Everything you just said, everything you just said reminded me of the Willie Lynch that I was taught as a child to be aware of. The second part is I'm hearing from you, wounded healer versus wounded healer versus a wounded healer versus an unhealed wounder when it comes to the type of leadership we may have in the church, not just pastor, but also associate missionary, not just the deacons. You know, we have to be careful that we are not wounded healers trying to heal or assist unhealed wounders. And then you have to look at the nature of man versus the nature of God. So I got all of that out of what you said, Dr. Edwards, mostly Willie Lynch and the nature of man versus the nature of God. And Dr. Spann, you probably can, with your spirituality dissertation, you know, you look at a lot of that when we were writing our dissertations, the nature of man versus the nature of God, and how does that tie into the spirituality piece and how we have to write and present. Because I received a lot of challenges when I was writing my dissertation because it was spirit-based. I had so much kickback. I had to fight to write about this because even my team, who were prominent African-American professors, was like, this is too much, it's too deep. So, you know, the spirituality part, nature of man versus the nature of God, being an unhealed wounder versus a wounded healer. And then on top of that, trying to get past the stigmas of what Willie Lynch has implanted in our church and also in our culture.
And I was gonna say that a lot of when we talk about our church and our culture, that it was basically to keep us, you know, oppressed and keep us in that space. So right, so if the place that you're going to for healing is the place that's supposed to keep you wounded, and because we weren't necessarily educated and we couldn't read for ourselves, we didn't know for ourselves things. A lot of it has just been regurgitated. So you had years and years and years of kind of what Danny was saying, people that are dealing with church hurt, but it's because we're just saying and preaching the same sermons that we were saying and preaching in slavery. I'm pretty sure, you know, if we had a recording of a sermon in slavery and you listen to one even in 2021, you would see some similarities there, right? Because a lot of it is just, it's still the same stuff. So how do you get to a place where you can start healing people if all you're doing is bringing up and using the same tools that were used to wound them?
I'd like what you're saying. I really think it also gets, as we were just talking before about the Black psychology and Black spirituality. As we think about, you know, Black spirituality at, you know, transatlantic, as we go back to West Africa, East Africa, we really think about the psyche. And I think what's happening now is like, we're not really aligning what is mind, body, and soul. And the reality is that it never was supposed to be separate, but you have a very westernized, Anglo-Saxon Eastern Europe identity around that. And so when you have a people that are very spiritual from West Africa, from the continent of Africa, enslaved and brought here, there's still a very strong sense of spirituality that is now then infused with what is the church. And so there's an identity of saying, well, we know that what is spirituality and what it means for psyche, but at the same time, then there's also another level of religiosity and doctrine and then colonization that is on top of that. And so I think there's this kind of fight to reunite and identify with that. And I think because you have Black mental health professionals that are like, hey, we want to get back into this point of understanding what is the psyche, what is spirituality, and how that impacts mental health. Now to connect that. And I think that's why this conversation is so important and so many other conversations, because I think we're doing the work on trying to say, how do we get that aligned again and understand what it means for us in our own Black psyche.
So are there roads to spirituality and healing for Black people outside of the Black church? Because a lot of people have been hurt by Black churches. So are there roads, and how do we begin to explore them and share that information with the Black community? Anyone?
Well, for me, and my practice, as I indicate, I work in two areas. I work in Christian counseling and also in secular counseling, and then I have some clients who want both. So when we're talking about church hurt, we're talking about hurt. We're talking about it. So it doesn't matter that it's church hurt. As a clinician, I'm operating on the hurt first. My model is to find out exactly what caused it. And a lot of times it can be something that may have occurred in church, or it could actually be something that the church in their eyes thought they have done. So I don't deal with the whole piece that it happens to be church hurt. As a clinician, I'm dealing with the overall part that this person was hurt, meaning this person was traumatized. This person has unresolved issues due to an issue or due to a concern or due to an event that may have occurred that may be church associated. So once I can get to that root, what caused this, then we can begin to peel back the layers in regards to see exactly what the role was in that. Now, that can be different. I mean, working with someone who had their first experience with sex, may have been good or bad, in church while everybody was singing in the choir, you had slipped off with somebody and got yourself in a situation, and then you were ostracized. That's different. But it's also the same when it comes to what that person and the stigmas may or may not have occurred. So, some of us, our first kiss was at the church, because you all your time was at the church. So your experiences may have been good or bad at a church setting. So we have to, as clinicians, identify exactly what the issue is and use your model, your clinical model, to start from that point, and then begin to peel the layers in regards to what the associations are.
I actually would counter that to say that I believe the experience of church hurt is different and unique in the sense that we have to understand the investment that is required when you become part of a religious community. You are investing in your spiritual care with leadership, which is incredibly intimate. I would never want to understate the level of intimacy required to engage in religious community. And so for that reason, I do tend to see church hurt be not only unique in how people present, but also the ways in which, or the levels at which it causes harm. There was an earlier statement that the church has historically been a safe space. And I'd like to say that for many of us, the church has not been a safe space for a number of years. And to make that statement and the statements associated with it thereafter kind of reminds me of this sense that the church, the Black church, is continuing to rest on its historic laurels. We are not having these actual conversations in real time about the ways in which Black women have not been safe in our pews for years. We make up the majority of congregations, and yet we are constantly at the apex of being, marginalized either because of our bodies. So our bodies are a site of sin, but they're also raised as this Madonna whore complex of holiness. Our, womanhood is at its pinnacle when we engage in marriage and motherhood, and we are sometimes singled out and ostracized when we are single. So the Black church has not been safe for us for a number of years. For queer folks, the Black church is obviously not a safe space for a myriad of reasons, not the least of which being those harmed Black women now using queer Black men or queer Black women or queer non-binary folks as a fulcrum and a tool to gain power within a already marginalized power structure within the Black church. So I think there are just so many levels and nuances that come to mind when I think about the church and when I think about church hurt that for me make it so much more unique, so much more I guess an act of betrayal, because it is supposed to be the space that I can go for respite. It's supposed to be a place that I can go for sustenance. And yet when parts of my identity are targeted and belittled and criticized as sinful, made to be demonic, all of these things, I think we can't ever understate the impact of how that influences someone's relationship to their spiritual selves, especially as Black folks, acknowledging that we are deeply spiritual people. To be damaged in that way damages the psyche in a way that I think has to be really addressed, not just by the church itself, but by professionals in a way that takes into account all of those nuanced ways in which I just kind of brought forward to consider. So those are kind of my immediate thoughts.
That was great feedback. I wanted to ask you, like, because the church isn't the only avenue for people to connect spiritually with their God. But what are some other ways that they can explore spirituality and to get healing from their hurts, from their pain?
So what I typically deal with is folks who have become unchurched. So they grew up in church, they were raised with it. I personally grew up charismatic Pentecostal, so I'm deeply Black church in that tradition. But we become unchurched, so we stop going to formal attendance or formal assemblies rather, because we don't have that fit. We don't have that space that makes us feel like we are worshiping a God that sees us both as whole and as holy. So we come up either with alternatives of like faith communities like mine. So we create digital faith communities where we come together and we do the work in ways that we wish to see the work done. But I hesitate to pigeonhole the Black church as one monolith, because you also have Dr. Edwards here, who is clearly talking in a way that I would expect a well-rounded, invested in the healing and the wholeness of folks in his congregation to speak. So you do have pastors and leaders and bishops and teachers who are literally doing the work inside of the church. So some of us are still inside the institution. We haven't left, and we feel like we can be agents of change there. So I don't think it's necessarily a dichotomous, either you're in the church or out of the church. Some of us are called to stay within the institution and do work to disrupt it as it has come. Some of us are also here in faith communities for people who cannot return to the institution for whatever reason. So, I mean, the text says where two or three are gathered, there am I in the midst. So whether or not you are in the formalized, institution of church with a, sanctuary and church building, or you're getting together in a prayer group, which some of my folks have told me that's what they're doing. They get together with a few friends, they have a prayer group, they, try to do Bible study, they try to do the same things that they felt like they were getting benefit from the church, but also layering that with the nuance and the care and the unpacking and deconstructing that their traditional church spaces didn't allow. So I don't think it's a dichotomous either or. I think if you can find a faith community that serves you, great. But if you want to stay in the church, then we need to be raising the visibility of leaders who are doing the work. We spend a lot of time talking about those who don't and not enough time supporting those who do. So I think it's a both and rather than an either or.
Okay. Thank you for that feedback. When we look at the church and we look at the Bible and scriptures, we also know that it's up for interpretation. So I want to talk a little bit about how interpretation of the word also can impact mental health, how people think about mental health, how it comes across the pulpit into the Black community as far as their own mental health, how that impacts their faith, because the Black community, we're people that are resilient. We're taught to be that way. We're taught to honor our faith, to pray. But what happens when the word of God isn't enough? What happens then? And how does that impact our faith when we do choose to say, hey, prayer is enough. I have to now go to mental health. But I have the church saying, based off of scripture, that God is my doctor, God is my lawyer. What then?
There's scriptural eisegesis, which just means that people are interpreting scripture through the lens of their experience. And then there's scriptural exegesis. There is theological deconstruction. There are those of us who are actually doing that work. And I hate to be this direct, but if you're in a place where your pastor is telling you that the word of God is telling you not to go to therapy, tell them to prove it. Tell them to pull it out, and not just what they thought in their mind with the scripture. Tell them to pull out a commentary. Tell them to pull out some academic papers. Tell them to prove it to you where it says that in the text. I always say that, like, what your pastor tells you, your spirit should resonate. And if your spirit does not resonate with what you're hearing, then you need to question the source, because what is being said to you is not meant to. You have to then ask, who benefits from my harm? Who benefits from my marginalization and my oppression? If you can convince me not to go get healed, what is the benefit there? And if we don't start asking those questions about who benefits from our marginalization, even those who look like us, we might ask those questions with non-Black, non-female, whatever, somebody who doesn't look like us, but we don't often interrogate in that same way people who look like us. For me, I'll be honest, I have been in therapy actively. My father died in January 2016. By January 2017, I was in therapy actively. And I have literally prayed before therapy sessions, Lord, speak to me through my therapist, because I trust that God can use her and speak to me and resonate in a way that I can go back to the text, or I can go back to my learnings and my knowings and my intuitive hearings, and then get what I need. So I believe in the co-relationship of both my spiritual care with a responsible pastor, and then my mental care with a responsible therapist, because I believe that I cannot do the work that I am called to do if I am not physically well. So my body is racked with stress and anxiety and all of these things, which doesn't allow me to focus the effort and energy I need to do the work I'm supposed to show up for. I can't show up if I am emotionally or mentally unwell, because that starts to affect my physical wellness. And when all three are out of bounds, there's no way in hell I can be spiritually well. So I personally believe in the coexistence of them all, but I think we need to start actively deplatforming pastors and churches that are going against these conversations of having real mental health care. A lot of times we're rewarding them by continuing to stay in their churches, continuing to tithe, continuing to show up and share their stuff. I was about to cuss, their stuff on social media. Like, we need to actively disengage people who are doing active harm. So part of this is on us, of saying, listen, what you're saying is harmful. It doesn't work. It's not serving the people well. It's not serving me well. So I'm going to walk out and leave. We can't be afraid to leave churches that are no longer serving us. We can't be afraid that the pastor's going to end up without a congregation. That's what they deserve. If they're actively out here doing harm, they should not be in a position of power to lead people. So I turn that question around to say, what do we do actively to respond to pastors who are doing that? We begin to stop letting them be pastors by leaving their churches.
That was interesting feedback. Anyone else want to comment?
Well, I would say, hi, Ms. Caldine Ray. How are you today?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. I was a youth pastor for 17 years. And I would say that we have to educate pastors, our pastors.
Exactly.
And a lot of them are open to you, for you to educate them. And that's what I do. When I get the opportunity, I share. Most of them, you know, when I lived in New York, my pastor knew that I was a counselor. So he said, please work with the families, work with the young people. So he was open to that. I live in Carolina now, and this pastor, he believes, that some people do have mental health issues, as well as he believes in divine healing. I believe in both, but I avail myself. If some women have come to me and say, Sister Cookie, I have this issue, I have that issue, and they know I have a small coaching business. So, they call me, whether they have money to pay me or not, I'm just available. So I believe that we have to educate them. Yeah. So we have to speak up. A lot of times we don't speak up, even during this pandemic. A lot of times we don't speak up. I went to my pastor and I said to him, some of us are seniors and we can't come into the church if everyone is not masked. And so he did. He masked part of the church for seniors. Anyway, he tried to do the best that he could because he couldn't please everyone he felt. And there are nurse managers, all types of health related people in my church, and no one took a step to speak up. So I think that we have a voice and we have to speak up. We can't just sit back and let things happen. We have to educate people.
Definitely agree with that. Education is key. A lot of organizations has began to implement programs such as the Department of Veteran Affairs, also National Alliance on Mental Illness. They have created programs to assist clergymen and women on how to react to mental health. Also, there's also mental health first aid that's out there that's available for everyone to educate themselves. Do you feel as though that's enough, or do you feel as though there should be a clear line of the roles of clergymen and health providers? Or do you feel like it's too enmeshed? Go ahead, Dr. Edwards.
I think it's interchangeable. I'm an opponent of education. When I was affected by a mental health issue, which nearly took my life, that's what sprung me to look through a different lens. It provoked me to go back to school after 25 years away from school.
That's good.
To start all over. And in my healing process, the second phase of seminary for me, looking for healing, which now is identified as clergy burnout, looking for approach, looking for method, I found none. It only hurt me even worse. Until I start to deconstruct or utilize the information I received prior seminary to start looking through a different lens. And I've discovered this, theologically and psychologically, for African-American people, those of us who normally overcome become what we overcome.
That's, it goes.
And so for me, the whole deconstructing, I had 40 years of pastoral experience, have a bunch of years in theology, from Black theology, a lot. But I had to take all of that, put it in a pot, and begin to deconstruct in order for me to become not well, but whole. And I had to begin here. Dr. Spann talked about utilizing 3 components of mind, body, and spirit. And I think at the crucible where we're at as African Americans in theology and spirituality is, when do we see or how do we get to the point of identifying ourselves? And identifying ourselves, we're able to maneuver. For most of us, our identity is based on someone else's definition, connotation, but more so expectation of who we are. And whenever we drift that way, we lose ourselves, we lose our identity across, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's sex. And so for me, being on platforms like this, I just tried to plant the seed. How can we deconstruct those negative components, whether it was from a theological, religious, or social understanding of who we are? Because I don't know about you, I'm tired of just walking healed. I want the rest of my life with a sense of wholeness, which means mind, body, and soul. And so I think the component of education, this is one thing about education. There's some of us that I don't think I'd gather from you all, but some of us, we matriculate to a certain degree that we think we have arrived.
Yes.
And I think it's time for all of us, despite our degrees, despite our experience, to come to tables such as these, to be able to put on the table our gifts and allow our gifts, our insight to be utilized rather than be destructive. And so when I talk about the church as being a community, it is the community that strengthens African Americans. And so we look at what's going on across the lines right now. I am very fearful of what will happen to my children, my grandchildren, 20 years down the line, because we have been broken spiritually, we've been fractured mentally. And when those two components are fractured to the point that there is no platforms or ministries, maybe virtually, to meet the needs of those who are hurting. Because the only place we have is, whether it's virtue, whether it's tradition, the only thing we have to develop fellowship, worship, and community is that what I call the Black church. The Black church for me is not just a building. It's the connection of mind, body, and spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Dr. Chase, you were about to say something?
Well, yes, I was saying that everything that Dr. Edwards was saying was basically goes back to physician heal thyself. You've got to have your own aha moment. You've got to have your own road to Damascus. You've got to have your own sense of identity, and you've got to be intentional and deliberate when it comes to making sure that you are, because I do believe that we're going to be held accountable for the people that God has placed before us in the role of a therapist, or in the role of an educator, in the role of a pastor. And to be in a position where he's not happy with the services that you have, that he asked you to perform, the gifts that he gave, there's going to be accountability for that. So it is imperative that we as clinicians, educators, pastors, youth pastors, I think a young lady said that she was a youth pastor, that we are responsible. We have to make sure that we strive every day to be whole, to be healthy, happy, helpful, and holy. The 4 H's: healthy, happy, helpful, and holy, in order for us to do the work that we do. If I don't feel up to working that day because I'm dealing with my own piece, I have the flexibility to rearrange my schedule and take time off for me to go back in and reevaluate. I can be that flexible running my own private practice. When I work for another agency, I mean, thank God I had leave. But sometimes I would still have to go in based upon the work that I had to do. Now that I'm able to operate on my own schedule, there are times when I need, I'll call Dr. Battle, or I'll call Dr. Latonia, and I'll vent about a case, or I will, I'll call. You have to have a support team. I have a couple of my clinicians, Allison Patton and Dr. Long. These are people that I work well with daily. And I talk to them daily, but you have to have an outlet where you can actually begin to release a lot of because I see sometimes up to 5 to 6 clients a day. And I want to be in a position to give them my best. And in order to do that, I have to be at my best. And if I'm not at my best, I don't want to put myself in a situation where I missed something because I was tired. And this person's been put before me for me to assist them, to assist with evoking change, to assist with their empowerment. And I missed out because I was tired. Jesus told the disciples, y'all was asleep. If you hadn't been up praying with me, maybe things would have been different. Y'all know that scripture when he was in Gethsemane, they were knocked out asleep. They were resting. Their bodies were tired. So you have to pace yourself. And I don't want to be in a position where I have to stand before the God that I serve and he not say, well done to me, because I know that I am gifted. I am talented when it comes to therapy. That is one of the gifts that he has given me. And I don't play and I don't take it lightly. So that's what I heard when Dr. Edwards was talking. That whole physician, heal thyself. You got to have your own road to Damascus. You got to have your own aha moments. And those aha moments should be coming throughout the year, not just one time. You should have aha moments throughout your entire, your entire career span for that year. You should be able to go back monthly and see what you've accomplished as a clinician, as a teacher, as an educator, not just for your clients and your students, but also what you have accomplished for yourself.
I'd like to, and thank you, Dr. Chase, for everything that you're saying, because I really think there has to be a lot of self-healing. And I think, the only way that we're going to do that is recognize where we do have the wounds, as well as dealing with trauma that's come through all of this process. Generational trauma that stems as soon as we got to the shore, and trying to deal with a lot of what is systematic oppression. And so just to use a quote from Audre Lorde, like, you cannot dismantle the master's house with his tools. And so as we think about spirituality, particularly the Black church, it's a really tough subject with us, because it's where we also have found refuge, but at the same time, there's a lot of trauma, as Danyelle is saying, and dealing with that. I think where we didn't have the strength and support is that we have a lot of Black mental health professionals. You have a lot of people that are in these spaces that are educated enough to say, how do we bring this back to this community? How do we bring it back to the Black church? Because, white folks wasn't bringing it over to us. It was seen as this was actually a white man's pleasure or ability for a white woman to get services of therapy. It was costly. So when you think about, for the Black community, some of it was like, hey, we would have to use this spirituality. We're going to have to use what we have to internally deal with our issues. Because we just know it wasn't a privilege for us. It just wasn't there for us. And so we have to acknowledge at one point now what we're actually saying, like, here is this ability to have mental health services. It just was not a concept for us. And so there is a strong emphasis on why this had to be the case when you had oppression from masters and overseers and all these other things of saying, well, death is this. It's living this life as an enslaved African, and this is all you have. And then heaven is where you'll actually get your relaxation. And that is something that slave masters and others were saying, well, this is the identity. And so when you think about it, now we have it where educated professionals, you have Dr. Edwards, you have Dr. Chase, you have Danyelle, Dr. Laffitte, Dr. Battle. We have the ability to go into our community, into our churches, and speak to them. And so it could start with leadership, going to the Baptist Church National Conference, which would probably be online at this point, going to these different conferences and saying, can I speak? Are there opportunities for us to connect together? Can I speak to my local church, offer my services pro bono, and do training, talk about these things? If we are not educating our community and telling them what this is, they may not have a concept. When I say they, that's lots of people in many communities, from Catholic to Baptist to Kojic, don't have a concept exactly what this is. And so we can't expect people to truly understand what we're doing just because we know what we're doing. We have to get other people to understand this. And so as we culture shift and as we move our culture forward, I think we'll really understand how these two are already one, mind, body, and soul. But there's responsibilities, and we all can take a responsibility in making that voice heard in spaces where it just normally wasn't the thing to do.
I think that all of this is very important, and I think that we do have a responsibility. We have a responsibility as clinicians to educate our clergymen. I think that on the flip side, that we're forgetting that there's a power dynamic here, right? And so I can come in and I can try to educate Dr. Edwards and let Dr. Edwards know this is where your lane ends and my lane begins. However, in me doing that, I'm taking, for a lot of Black leaders, I'm taking power from you, right? You're in a position of authority, you're in a position of power, you're making decisions based on your divine guidance, and sometimes we don't know what that divinity is that is guiding you, for the congregation, and you're sharing that, right? And a lot of pastors, they're receptive to an extent, right? And Bridget, you can speak to that because you dealt with that at your church when you were running the Christian counseling component of your church, and they wanted to jump into your lane.
And and it was very challenging because I'm not going to document the type of people who are coming into my office to see me. I'm not putting that in black and white. That is pastoral counseling and clinical counseling from a licensed clinician. There's a confidentiality piece there. I can't go to Dr. Edwards. I'm a member of his church. He's hired me to be his Christian counselor. He knows I'm licensed by the state, several states. And then Dr. Edwards says, well, can you tell me what you and my wife talk about every Tuesday? No, I can't share that with you. Well, I'm the pastor. If you can't trust the pastor, who can you trust? I trust God, and I trust that I have a credential that I'm going to keep for the past 27 years. So Dr. Edwards, I can't share with you what your congregation is coming to talk with me about. I can give you some statistics. I saw 12 people this week that may have dealt with depression, but I can't put people's names on, I can't do psychosocial assessments and give those to you and let you look over those and be concerned that you're not going to share that with somebody else. It has to be a level of respect and trust. So it can be very challenging when you're trying to keep confidentiality and trying to make sure that you're putting that person in a safe place. Because many times people will say to me, is this conversation confidential? Am I going to be, is my so-and-so going to find out about it? And it can be very challenging for people to even trust Christian counseling at a church.
Yeah. And so, I think that adds a different, adds a layer to the conversation because, you go to the church for so much and you expect so much for it because it's the center of our community, but that's a lot of power for one person to have. And when this was established, the way that it was established, if you look at our sermons, I often say our Christianity and white Christianity, they two different Christianities. To keep us subservient and subjected, right? So the sermons, even the pastor preached, like Dr. Span was saying, heaven is where your reward is. You do what you're supposed to do down here. Well, that also kept the pastor in power. It kept him in a position, right? Like he was allowed to preach on Sundays and do his thing on Sunday and have have whatever rights and privileges he received on the plantation after we got off the plantation within our communities, right? Go ahead, Dr. Edwards.
One thing, Sister Danyelle Thomas alluded to a safe space. I think in each of our profession, I think we have to, whether it's church, whether it's counseling, one, we have to create safe space by transparency. I hear the church piece, and what I've discovered that my goal in mental health, I'm in school now, hope we finish soon, is not really, I want to be licensed, but that's not my goal. My goal for going back to school was to get education, to educate people. And for me, I thought Dr. Chase had looked in my book, because a lot of stuff she was saying is in my book, which will be out shortly, entitled Screaming. Why are so many of us screaming? The issue for me, for transparency amongst congregants, particularly African-American community, how can counselors make that context safe for their clients? I'm hearing a dualistic thing, safe in church, safe in counseling. Again, it's education. One of the strangest things that I've discovered, because of how long I've been preaching, because of my exposure, because of my story within the academy, within the church, across the country, when people invite me to come, I just don't inform pastors. For me, it's pastor congregation. And I think so often we give power, expect pastoral leadership and not connect congregational participation. This is one thing, I'm not going to say nothing else. This is what struck me, even about the whole mental health discipline. The whole mental health discipline began as a philosophy that was a spin-off of theological thought. And so the psychology and theology have to be integrated in a way that it is transformative. And so for me, when people see what transformation looks like, it took me a long time to be honest about my story. Dr. Jeremiah Wright and Y.T. Walker said to me, when you go back to school, I'm looking for resources. Wounded Healer, which is 40 years out of print, basically. He says, you create the model, you create the conversation. Phil Brooks says this, truth through personality, which means no matter what discipline we are, our discipline should reflect our experiential conditioning in a way that is helpful and not harmful. And so education comes in each of our contexts to be transparent, because all of us, each of us correctly, have been wounded by something or someone. And once we are healed or transformed, is our responsibility, whether it's theologically, whether it's clinically, to be transparent enough to allow our empathy to connect to the people we serve. And until then, we're just recycling the same thing, pointing out the same problems, but no one is taking time to try not to patch, but try to reconstruct and transform what has been broken or wounded.
Isn't that the same as a level of insanity when you keep perpetuating the same cycle over and over again? I
started the conversation out by saying this, Dr. Chase, that the Black church is in a schizophrenic state. What do? We keep doing the same. We do the same thing. What does, for us, what does transformation really look like? What does it look like? We throw the words around, but transformation ought to have some evidence of some wounds, some scars. But most of us are so perfect that we don't want to reveal our wounds or scars. Our scars and wounds is just a reminder of a method that I utilize that got me beyond what I've been wounded by. And so as I move forward from a Christian theological faith is substance things hoped for and evidence of things not seen, this is my definition of faith. It's walking into the vast darkness of nothingness with the anticipation of running into light, which means when I come out of the darkness, you will see what God had been doing. So theologically, we have to deconstruct. And so even when we're going through something mentally, we consider it dark. When we're coming through hurt, we consider it dark. But we don't deal with the upside of what dark is. Think about this. All of us are believers somehow. In the beginning, God created all this stuff, right? It says first it was dark. It was black, right? But out of the blackness, when the light came on, watch, when God said, let there be light, what he had been working on in the dark was manifested in the light. Nowhere do you see God creating birds. Nowhere you see God creating trees. When the light came on, is a reflection of what God was doing in the midst of the darkness. And so as we practice, as we preach, as we're going through hurt, as we're going through trauma, we have to understand from a theological basis that the darkness is the period of forming and transforming. That when we get to the light of transparency, that's what God is doing. And I think that's where we have been at for a long time. We've been so much connected to the darkness that we don't anticipate God cutting on the light to show the manifestation of our lives and our discipline and our professions in a way that is restorative.
I want to say something as we talk about Christianity. Christ really, if you look back, was a radical.
Yes.
Doing. And so we really have to be very radical in how we're doing this. And, if we think about that, there was a lot of policies in place. There were a lot of things that actually were a lot of what we're kind of talking about now, but it's just transformed itself into something different. I think if we think about social justice, if we think about what it is to really look at how to dismantle something that was really used as a tool and governing us, and then re-examining what that really feels like and looks like for us. And I don't know if we really have taken the time to do that and finding spaces of solace for very many people that have been marginalized by the church, by the experience. But that goes beyond just the Black church. It's really a larger issue, I think, as to Danyelle was saying, like a monolith of things. Yeah. But this is where that empowerment, that's where this ability to look through what is the pain, the trauma, as we talk about being in the dark and then turning on the light. There is a whole shift in movement where our ancestors have fought for this, the ability to now have our spirituality, the Black church, in a way that can be formed and shaped in a way that we truly are able to heal by using our professionals, by using our brothers and sisters, by not marginalizing that. And I think the way that we're going to have to do that is be very radical in the idea behind that, and take a lot of the teachings of Christ from love, being radical, understanding what it is to be human in these spaces. And, you know, we have the opportunity to do that more than ever. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation.
Thank you for that. So speaking of being radical, is it okay for therapists to bring spirituality into the therapy room with the client without being too religious? And how do they do that? Dr. Chase?
Well, for me, I'm listed on most insurance carriers as Christian and secular counselor. So a lot of times when I get and it's amazing that most of the referrals I get from commercial, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Cigna, those people, they have sought me out on that portal, and it specifically says one or the other, or if you want both. So as I indicated earlier, I try to operate from an integrative approach. I am not preachy, I'm not super spiritual, any of that in my sessions. I meet them where they are. Where are they on that road to Damascus? And I pray and ask God to give me the gifts that I need at this particular time for this particular session, so I can assist with empowering and invoking change with this client. Keyword assist. It's not my goal to push. It's not my goal to project. It's not my goal to do anything but meet them where they are. And sometimes they can be super, super deep. And then other times they can be super insecure or inadequate when it comes to, well, I understand God. I don't quite know what that means, but I do know that I believe, you know. So it's always starting with them. My goal is to assist that client. And so I meet them where they are and identify as both on most insurance panels. And then in my private practice, I'm listed as both. But it's not about me at that point. It's about what that client needs, what that client wants, and then we pull from that. So I pull from all resources. And I've been very, very fortunate. I have a huge clientele of male and female clients. I even have some clients who are non-religious. Mm-hmm. Now and then we'll break into, you know, speaking about, and I find that amazing because they made it perfectly clear. I don't want nothing to do with God. I just want to come in this session and I find, you know, and I totally meet them where they are, and then eventually they'll start. So it's always where they are and where they want to go based upon that road. I hope I'm making sense when I say that.
Yes, definitely. And I did ask the question based off of personal experience I had. I remember having probably about a 20-minute conversation just talking about soothsayers one time. So, you know, not everyone comes up, maybe a Christian that we encounter, but we have to be able to, as you say, reach the clients where they are at.
Mm-hmm. And I think too that that education piece as well is because we're not the expert necessarily in the room on that person, right? And so if they bring something into the therapy session, I'll tell them I don't know anything about that. So you're teaching me right now. So we'll have a conversation about that, and I may share my experience. Just yesterday, I had a client that is a Christian, and we were talking basically about this topic, and we were talking about the fact that most Christians nowadays aren't Christians; they're Pharisees and Sadducees, and that it's all about Christianity has become a thing of you hating who I hate for the reasons I hate them. Right? Wow. It's not a thing of us coming together, because a lot of what when much of what Dr. Span said, Christ was a radical, and we're not being radical. We're repeating the same messages. We're treating people the same ways that we've seen historically, when we're supposed to be following the man that said, if eating meat offends my brother, I won't eat meat. Right? We're supposed to be following the man when they came to arrest him and Peter cut off the soldier's ear, went and healed the man and put the ear back on. But we're totally contrary to that in what we do and how we treat people. And I think that speaks even to what Danny was saying about the church hurt piece, is because people are coming into this place and into this space where we're told that it's supposed to be a safe space, and it's not really a safe space unless you fit a very a box. It's not really a safe space for you. And then everyone that's outside of that gets alienated and gets beat up on and gets marginalized. And they leave that space feeling bad about themselves. it's almost like the love songs that we listen to. You know, it's like it's not real love unless it hurts you. Well, that ain't the way love's supposed to be. That it's supposed to be when you go to church, and church is supposed to be the place where you get healed and you get filled so that you can go out and deal with stuff for the next week. But we don't feel like we've had church unless we've had a pastor that makes us feel bad about ourselves in some way. And that's a spiritual experience for us.
Right.
And we walk around shouting and sweating out y'all's good clothes and falling on the floor and getting covered by sheets and towels and getting olive oil slathered all over you. And you feel like you've had an experience. But if you go to a place where they don't make you feel bad about yourself and they're empowering you and building you up, then we haven't been taught how to deal with that.
Great feedback. I want to open it up to questions, but before we do that, Dr. Chase had an interesting story that she shared with us before we got started. And I wanted her to just talk a little bit about that, because as clinicians and clinicians who may have worked in pastoral care, she had a unique experience. So I wanted her to talk a little bit about that, because this is an educational session and we need to learn from each other. And that is the purpose of this, is to learn. And I wanted her to share that story, because each and every one of us may have had a story like that, but we may have acted differently. So I wanted her to share her story and her response.
Is this in regards to the suicide person? Okay. So I'm going to say maybe, wow, when I say 10 years ago, that's like a decade. Can you imagine? Who could imagine 10 plus years ago? I was working in an environment that was solely Christian, basically primarily doing Christian counseling, which was phenomenal. And I was approached by 5 leaders of a church. There had been a death in that church, and they wanted me to come and do critical incident on-site response management, which is basically, triage counseling on the site, because the person worked at the church. So I was all for it. We were talking, and they indicated that the person had died at the church, and they wanted me to come in and speak to the staff and speak to the leadership and possibly speak to any of the membership of the church in regards to this particular person. She was an associate pastor, was very loved, had been at the church in that leadership role for well over 20 years. She got married at that church. Her husband was a deacon, leadership in the church. They had 3 children. And she worked full time as the associate pastor. Well, I was all for everything. And then one of the leaders indicated that she had committed suicide. She literally committed suicide in her office by overdosing on her prescriptions. She left a suicide letter in her office. And the suicide letter was basically an apology to her husband and children. But she apparently dealt with depression, had been dealing with this for years, and she felt that the medication wasn't working. I'm paraphrasing, but from what they were saying to me. Now, mind you, I was all for coming in, speaking with the leadership, speaking with the congregation, speaking with the on staff. And then the leadership person said that she committed suicide and left a suicide letter. So we decided, because the church knew that the insurance that they had on this particular person would not pay for suicide. So they removed the suicide letter. They removed the pills. They tampered with the site of this person's. They totally reconstructed the room and made it appear that she had she had made a mistake and had overdosed inadvertently to save the parents, to save her parents were pillars in this church, to save her parents, to save her husband, and to save her children financially, but also to save the church for the embarrassment of a 20-year associate pastor committing suicide in her office at her church. So as soon as that came out, my whole dynamic changed. But prior to them saying that to me, I felt that I said, well, first off, let me focus on working with the 5 of you, because y'all were the ones that found her. You were the ones that so I wanted to work with them first and make sure to find out where they are. And that's when they broke that nugget in by saying, oh, by the way, she committed suicide. Oh, by the way, we removed the suicide letter because she would not be able to get her insurance policy paid, and the family would be destitute. And the idea that she killed herself here in this office, here at this very prestigious church, we just didn't want that to happen. So I had to then move back and remind them that the law supersedes ethics. So by law, law supersedes ethics. It had nothing to do with the church. It had nothing to do with the suicide. It had nothing to do with what they wanted me to do. They had come together. The Bible says, don't let your good works be thought evil of. And you cannot, that scripture there is totally associated to what this team of 5 did. Don't let your good works be thought evil of. They decided, those 5 people decided it was best to tamper with evidence, tamper with the scene, and recreate another scenario for the church, for the family, for the congregation, and for the community. And I could not be a part of that. So you have to remember, even when you're working in the body of Christ, if you are a licensed clinician, you have a responsibility not only for what's right, but what has to be right when it comes to, that's a secret that I will always keep, yes. But I could not be a part of anything because the illegalness in that process made it more, but it made it way more serious than what they thought. So that's what we were talking about prior to the conference starting.
And sometimes we're taught or we're trained within the Black community to keep things hidden when it comes to mental health. You know, somebody take pills and they'll say, oh, that's just her nerve pill. And the kids grow up never knowing what that nerve condition was, the proper name for it. They haven't been right since whatever happened, and just not knowing. We're taught to hide things. So how do we change the stigma against mental health and be more transparent without hurting clients? Anyone?
I think, you know, and when we think about it, I see that there is this shift, a larger shift in people coming out and sharing that this is something that I too am dealing with. You know, even just hearing from today's discussion, there's been a sharing of I too deal with this, and seeing it on a larger level with a lot of celebrities coming up and saying I too deal with this, and you're seeing a lot of other professionals and saying, you know, men do hurt, or check on your brother, and I feel like that's where we have to open up and say that, you know, as we think about what is stigmatized, that is what is a solo issue, is actually something that is very common or shared, or something else that somebody else is going through. And I think when we perpetuate keeping something closeted, it continues to have that hurt and pain continue. Now, it's not everybody's work to do that, but if we're able to get out where we're able to take away that power from the stigmatization, and we're able to show that there are other people that are dealing with this and how they've been dealing with it, and how to get support, and how to seek out the individuals that can help by getting over the barriers, I think that's really the step. Now, has the community totally changed, the Black community, on how we look at mental health? No, but has it shifted? I totally believe so. From what it was just 10 years ago, we've definitely made some strides, but we still have a long way to go. But at the same time, I think it's because people have stepped up and are sharing these things. And I think the more we can have transparency, as we talked about, that's a way of getting others to understand, like, this is something that people do deal with, and taking away some of the harder stigmatization around being crazy or having this darker experience around it, but understanding that with the psyche, any part of our body can be unaligned, mind, body, or soul. And when we think about Black psychology or Black psyche, it's about how do we get it back aligned again as much as we can. And I think we have enough professionals out here that actually can hold that space culturally for individuals, and that we can do better with making sure that we can hold space for our communities as well as others.
Thank you for that. So I want to go ahead and open up for questions or feedback. No one have questions? All right, I turn it back over to Dr. Nick.
It helps if I unmute myself, right? Thank you, Dr. Laffitte. I have been following the chat. I think we did answer all of the questions in the chat. We have had a request for a part 2 of this. I did let the panel know that if we did get a request, that we will be reaching out to them for a second part of this. So we will have a second part. Just to let you know, I have been posting things in the chat. We have a discussion group every month on the third Sunday at 1 o'clock. Next month, we're going to be talking about the school to prison pipeline. We have a dynamic group of professionals that will be participating in that discussion. And in April, we're going to be talking about, we're going to be having a real conversation with women. And we have 3 phenomenal Black women sex therapists. And we have the moderator for that discussion is out of this world. And we're going to be talking about conversations that Black mothers don't have with their daughters about sex, love, and relationships.
Awesome.
And in May, we're going to be having a conversation about being a Black mother and being a mother of Black children. Because we've had a lot of requests for that. So that's what we're going to talk about in May. Also coming up in May, we're having again, remember, I told you from the beginning of this conversation that NABC is for us, by us. We will be having our symposium in May. And if you're a mental health professional and you need to get your CEs, we're going to be offering CEs. I think we still have space for proposals if someone wants to present. I think we're still reviewing those. You have to hurry up and get it in. If you're interested, you can email me directly and or send me a message and I will send you the information on that. I have also been putting the information for all of our panelists in the chat so you can connect with them online as well. We do have a YouTube channel. Yeah, NABC is doing some things. If
Awesome.
you better find out and ask somebody. We have a YouTube channel where we're posting all of our discussions. So if you miss a discussion or if you wanted to share this discussion with someone, it will be up. We'll put the link on our webpage and also on our Facebook. So I encourage you to not only follow us on our social media, follow our presenters. We're going to post on our webpage information that was shared about the different resources that are available to pastors. What I would say in closing is that we really have to take to heart what our panelists have said, that we have to do work on ourselves, that we have to hold those in leadership in our communities accountable and responsible, right? And recognizing that really being a pastor is service. I think that we've got this flipped in our head. I mean, and it's the same thing when we look at our politics and those people that are elected officials. They work for us. We don't work for them. They're called to do something for us, right?
That's right.
Is called to serve our community. And if this person is not doing that, much to what Danny said, then we need to take that authority from them. We either leave their church or, if it's a good Baptist church, y'all have a meeting and y'all vote them out, like whatever, whatever you do. But these people, they're here to serve us. We need to not be afraid to share what is going on with us, because my process, my testimony isn't just for me, it's for somebody else to hear and see that I've gone and I've done and I've dealt with this, so can you. So just leaving you all with that. We will be doing a part 2 of this and we'll continue this conversation. And I'm just trying to make sure that I'm getting everything that people are saying. Yes. Oh, and the other thing that I like to remind people is this isn't just a conversation for us, right? Share this with your community, with our community, right? This is the starting point, right? Not to get churchy, but I'm gonna get churchy because I'm PC. One plant, one water, right? The other person goes out and they reap it, right? So we all have something to do. You've gotten this nugget, you've gotten something from this, a seed has been planted with you, then go forth and share that with the larger community. That's why we record these videos, so that you can always share that with someone else so they can see it and they can carry on that conversation. Thank you again for participating. Dr. Barner, Dr. Furby, do you all have anything to share?
Dr. Nick, I would like to, Dr. Battle, I'd like to say something. As a participant, I just want to say thank you for the panel. And I'm coming at this a little bit differently. So this has been refreshing to my soul. Growing up in the Black church, in the CME tradition, but having gone to seminary and served as pastor and associate pastors in Southern Baptist Convention. So needless to say, I'm coming from a perspective of some spiritual wounding, things like that, but I've always been that person to come alongside as pastoral counselor. I'm in the process of putting licensure in place. So I just want to let everyone know on the panel that this has been very, very, very encouraging to me. And it has been, soothing to my soul, and it gives me at 59 some energy to keep on keeping on, and as our ancestors would say, move on up a little higher. So thank you for putting this together, and God's blessing. I would be remiss if I didn't say that. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Turner.
You're welcome.
You reminded me to thank my panelists. As I say, every discussion we have, we don't bring no mess, right? We have renowned, respected, educated, articulate. This is Black excellence right here, right? I would venture to say that this is what our ancestors dreamed, realized is us coming together and having discussions, educating each other, uplifting our community, right? That's what they wanted, right? Was for us to build us. And that's what we're doing here. And I thank my panelists. I reached out to these people and I was like, hey, I'm having this discussion. Do y'all want to join? I'm putting you down. And nobody said no, nobody hesitated. Danny knows me from Facebook, and I've never called her, never texted her, never Uvo'd her, Zoomed her, or anything. She didn't have, I sent her a message on Facebook and said, Danny, I want you to be a part of this panel. And she said yes. And she showed up and she did her thing. Dr. Span, I think I sent him a group chat. Dr. Edwards, I hunted down his number and got him. Dr. Laffitte, I just told her, and Dr. Chase, I told her I put you on a flyer, you participating. Nobody said no, right? Everybody said yes. And that is, I believe, what our ancestors wanted us to do. What their dream realized is us helping us building us up, and us motivating each other. I'm going to let you all go. I will send out information about the part two. Thank you all again. Dr. Furby, if you don't have anything to say, Dr. Bonner, if you all don't have anything to say, I'm going to let everyone go. Thank you all. Have a blessed Sunday.
Thank you. This was awesome, Dr. Battle. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I got to join this. I got to join now. I'm hooked. I got to join.